All right, folks. It's Johnny here from Eco Geek Company. I just thought I'd just do something to help people who are in the middle of things with COVID-19, as everybody else is. Obviously, there's quite an urgent need to exit a lot of buildings and shared workspaces and establishments for hospitality and tourism, and a need to also reduce operational costs for many companies and facilities during uncertain times. So I've just put together a very quick video, very simple, just to give some ideas on where you can look at of things to shut down or settings that you can change to have quite a big impact on your energy bills for the buildings when they're not really occupied. So here's some basic things to go through that might help. So the first part is just for small business owners. So this is the sort of motels and hotels and cafes. It's a wide range of establishments. The key one there is domestic hot water. So it's again a no-brainer, but sorry if you already know a lot of this stuff. There will be some bits maybe you don't, and some bits that you do. But the key thing here is if you're sure that you don't need any hot water, it's not going to be used within the hotel room, you might have a chain of these hot water cylinders throughout your facility. They can account for about 35% of your energy baseload, so it's quite a lot of money being spent continually keeping water at 70 degrees, which is quite high. So quite simple, if you don't need them, you're going to be unoccupied for a while, you can just switch the isolator switch off at your cylinder. There should often be a little tiny small domestic switch next to the cylinder. Or if you can't see that, have a look on your fuse board, and there should be a little fuse switch named hot water cylinder. You can switch it off there. With gas as well, you can isolate the gas valve if it's in good condition, and then switch off the electricity to that as well. Next up, we have time clocks. So have a look to see if any of these are on your fuse board. They could be running lighting circuits, they could be running hot water, or they could be running, say, night storage heaters. Often whenever you see a time circuit, it can often be a reasonable load, depending on what's connected. So if you're sure that you don't need the thing that it's going to be running, you can just switch them off. So on this one, you can see here, you can either leave it to the eye, which means it's going to be on the full time, or it's currently on time clock is where it's sat, or you can switch it to 0, and then that will switch it off. If you're unsure, you can push all these ones back in, but take a photo first so you can actually see when you come to reset it, how it was in its original position. So that's one little area. The other one, this is often forgotten about, if you have a lot of air conditioning units and heat pumps installed, they have inside them a little crankcase heater. It's a little tiny heater to keep the compressor warm. And the reason for that is so when you start it up, it can run efficiently and quickly. So it keeps the crankcase oil at a certain temperature. That on a small heat pump to a reasonable one will use a base load of anything from 150 watts to 300 or 400 watts every hour of every day. So if you've got a lot of these around, they can add up. If you have a lot of empty accommodation buildings and motels, these are a quick win for you. Outside with every heat pump should be an isolator switch, a weatherproof isolator. If you're sure that unit's not going to be used for a while, just switch it off. That will remove the standby power. Whenever you want to reactivate them, switch the switches back on and give it about 3 or 4 hours before you want to actually use the heat pump. But that can save a lot. It can be as much as $35 per heat pump per month on your bill. So if there's a lot of them, it's quite a big energy load. The other one is occupancy sensors. So if you have a lighting control system, or any means on your switchboard to switch to occupancy control, I strongly advise doing it. What's called passive infrared sensors are pretty good at detecting people, and having the lighting operated around that at this time is probably best if your building's going to be vacated. It also means people don't need to touch switches, which is another potential contact point for passing on any virus. So removing the need for touching switches and activating occupancy sensors makes sense right now. And the other one is if you're like a motel and lots of hotels, you might have lots of mini fridges throughout your accommodation units. You might already isolate these and switch them off and open the door as standard, but they do add up as an energy load. They can be 400 to 600 watts each. So yeah, switch them off at the wall and leave the door open so they don't smell. And of course, help yourself to the miniature bottle of whiskey because these are tough times. Now we're on to large facilities. So this is for people who have buildings that might have lots of HVAC equipment or what's called building management systems. So if you have a building management system, right now your best friend is your scheduler. So if you're able to open up your scheduler on the BMS or talk to your controls engineer, what you want to do is review all the points on that schedule to understand what equipment is programmed to come on and when. And then you can logically go through it and just do a quick risk assessment of going, okay, well, if we switch this off or switch it into holiday mode or program it off for the rest of the next month, what is the possible impact on my facility? So if your facility is just straight up offices, quite simple, fairly minimal impact. If you do have labs or pressurized environments or anything that might require aspects of dehumidification, then you've got to be more careful. And also the same goes if you have server rooms. But working with your controls engineer, they should be able to help you identify fairly low risk things that could be switched off. It's going to be your best friend. There's some significant energy savings that could be made through simply switching things off through the scheduler or programming them to reduce the time they're running for. The other one is my bugbear with a lot of the way buildings are designed. You'll often have a very big boiler. There's often two boilers, one running lead and one running lag, tied together. They'll be providing hot water, which is then used to run your, say, fan coil units to heat or temper the air that comes into the building. And then the other circuit will be to run your hot water cylinders or your calorifiers throughout the building. If no one was in the building, it doesn't make sense to keep these systems going. It doesn't make sense, certainly for the domestic hot water side. So what you might want to do is get on the BMS system and reduce the set point or switch off the domestic hot water. It's often these very large gas boilers can be running just to provide a bit of hot water to some hand basins. And if your building is fully vacated, there's no sense in keeping them active. There's a very big CO2 profile associated with these, and a lot of gas is consumed just keeping all those miles of pipework and water hot just for a hand basin on the 15th floor. So my advice is to work again with your controls engineer to figure out the best way to isolate and switch off your domestic hot water system. If you're a bit nervous about switching off any heating or cooling systems, one thing you can do is actually widen what's called the deadband. So a deadband is where you have a temperature band where you're going to say at this temperature activate the heating and at this temperature activate the cooling. The closer they are, the more your systems are going to be activating to keep what's called a narrow deadband. So it's quite common that we run our offices at, say, somewhere between 21 and 23 degrees. So it's pretty tight deadband between heating and cooling. During this time of low occupancy or no occupancy, if you want to make sure there's some base heating to keep the buildings dry if it's very, very cold, you can basically widen the deadband to basically say don't activate the heating unless it gets to below 12 degrees in this space. And likewise with the cooling, you can push that pretty high unless you have, say, a server room that you're worried about, but most of those will have their own dedicated air conditioning unit. So pretty much you can make a huge impact through just changing the set point and widening that deadband. Next up is outdoor air. So buildings basically have to suck in a certain amount of air to provide air to every occupant within the building. That air has to be heated or cooled. It has to be filtered. or sometimes it has to be dehumidified. And so the amount of energy systems that you have in this chain is quite substantial. So often buildings throughout set points of occupancy, so maybe an office day, they'll be drawing in a lot of outdoor air and ramping that up or down according to the number of occupants in the building. The set points being called for, or what's called CO2 sensors, which are often a measurement of how full a room is. So it can say, hey, this room's producing X amount of CO2, that must mean X amount of people are there, therefore bring in more fresh air so they don't go to sleep. If you haven't got any users in the room, you might have nobody in the building, these systems become redundant. So you can reduce or switch off the outdoor air system, but I strongly advise having what's called a purge, where you have it set to come on, say, for a half hour or an hour blast in the morning, and another blast during midday, and another blast in the evening. So you're just turning over the air in the building, but you're not providing it stocked with heated or cooled fresh air continually, which is done by very, very big fans that cost a lot to run. So that is an area where you can make another huge saving on your energy bill whilst your building is in effective lockdown. So a good one to do. Lots of energy use there. The other one is car park fans. So if you have basement parking, multi-story parking, indoor parking, often by code you have to have a big fan to deal with the nasty carbon monoxide emissions that come off vehicles. That fan has to pretty much operate all the time, suck in the air and blow it outside where it goes to everybody else. But you don't need that. If your car park is not occupied, you can just switch that fan off and have it off for the next month whilst the building's in isolation. Unless that car park is used, you shouldn't need that fan, and you shouldn't need it when people finally move to electric vehicles, which is happening. The other one is duct heaters. So these are quite significant resistive energy draws. They can be around 6 kilowatts or 6,000 watts per unit. If you have them in your ducting system to temper fresh air, it might be air that's just being cooled to drop the humidity out and then reheated. That's a primary place. So generally, if you've switched off your air conditioning system or reduced that set point or widened that deadband, these should switch down anyway. But sometimes it might be worth manually switching them off because they're very, very big inductive loads which can add up. So have a look at, or talk to your controls engineer to see if there are any direct electric duct heating installed, and how can you make sure that doesn't activate as much, or switch it off. I put this one in here as well because we've got to consider water. It doesn't make sense to continually allow automatic flushing to happen if no one is using the facility. There's millions of litres of water that we can all save, which doesn't make sense for it to be flushed down the pan. So quite often you'll have, one of the prime ones is urinal banks. They will have a tank up in the mid-ceiling or behind the wall that's set to flush when it gets full automatically, or flush with a time clock. So a quick one is to do is review the time clock and stop it from flushing, or simply isolate the flush valve as well, because they're not needed. Put up a little sign to say urinals have been isolated during this time. You can just simply reactivate them a couple of days before everyone gets back to work. If you're worried about any smells, it's minimal. It's really not a problem. But it saves a lot of money on your water bill, and it does a good thing for society. The other one is that people have maybe exited the office fairly hastily to start setting up their home office and working remotely. In that process, they might have left a few devices switched on at their desk, primary one being computer monitors. They don't use a huge amount of energy by themselves, but if you add them up, it can be a big load and it's not needed. So if the monitor's left on, you see a screensaver, just switch it off at the switch. But my advice is don't touch computers. If you see a computer hard drive is operating, leave it alone. It will use energy, but it might be that someone needs to VPN into that machine externally, and it could cause them interruption to their work. So my advice is to leave the computers going. but switch off the monitor. Look for any phone chargers, any peripheral devices that are plugged in that don't need to be, and just switch them off at the switch. The other one is printers, desktop printers and communal printers. Switch them off. They're just not going to be used. No one's going to be there to pick up that paper. So people shouldn't be hitting print and sending it to the office. And if they have, it's probably a mistake. Now, the other one is just a quick one I put in at the end, which is supporting staff at home on how they can also reduce their energy bills now they're going to be working at home in their spare room, at the kitchen table, or wherever they are. Most people in New Zealand often don't have central heating installed. It's crazy, I know. But they're very reliant on inefficient gas heaters or quite inefficient plug-in convector heaters. So a typical one is an oil column heater or a sort of warehouse Bunnings sort of heater. These cost a lot of money to run. They're often around 2,400 watts each, and they heat the air in the room. So it means you're having to heat the entire volume of the space using lots of energy, and people are paying residential rates for electricity, which, as you know, isn't cheap. So we developed a bit of a solution for that for home offices and for open plan offices, where you can install an underdesk carbon crystalline heater, which uses 130 watts instead of 2,400 watts. And that heats the occupant and around two square meters around them, and keeps them warm when they're stationary at their desks, so they can turn down the heating in the room or not use so much energy at home. So if they feel the cold, it's pretty good. But that's one idea that you can do to save energy. The other one is when you do a walkthrough through your facility, do keep an eye out for plug-in heaters. They can make an appearance, especially if some people feel the cold more than others, and it is possible that some have been left on. So that's a prime place to save energy. Anyway, so it's just a quick, simple video to give you some ideas on where you can look at to put your buildings in a holding pattern, reduce the energy wastage and save some money for your organization. So just some ideas. Give your BMS controls engineer a call. Talk to your electrician about what systems you might have. Do a walkthrough of your plant rooms. Do check your hot water systems and evaluate whether you truly need them or not. So, you know, you can then decide what can be switched off. You'll be the best to judge that. But yeah, I'm Johnny from EcoGeek. I hope that's been helpful, and I'll see you next time.